Before we start, a quick note and commemoration. Some of you won't be aware that Lee Bozialone, a friend of mine and a friend of many of the guests we have on Analysing Doctor Who, sadly passed away recently. Lee, even though none of us called him Lee, we knew him as Buzz, he was one of the most friendly and personable people I've been lucky to meet. And in a low-key way also had an influence on how I even podcast. He's a huge loss, and all our thoughts are with his loved ones. There is a GoFundMe currently online to try and offer some support to his widow, and the link to that will be in the show notes. And this is the first pod we recorded since his passing. So as best you can, enjoy the show. This one's for you, Buzz. I'm Shane Thomas and this is Analysing Doctor Who. I'm joined today by Mark Gibbons and Mike Robinson. Now, we don't always talk about the classic incarnation of Doctor Who here a lot, but it is important to remember that the show didn't start in 2005, and as such, we are going to talk about one of the Doctor's older companions, Dorothy Gale McShane, better known to us as Ace. Now, I have been on a record, I have a pretty limited knowledge of the classic version of the show, so just as well that I have Mike and Mark here. So Mike, if I just start with you on Ace, what was the first episode you remember seeing her in?
The very first episode I saw was Dragonfire. Here in the States, we were getting Doctor Who mostly through public television stations, and I was in college at University of Maryland College Park back then, and Maryland Public Television had a really loyal relationship with Doctor Who. They had figured out that a lot of people would tune in on Saturday night to watch the program. We would get it, a little unfortunately, we would get it mushed together in a movie. So we weren't always getting the cliffhangers. Sometimes the cliffhangers were there and they just showed one episode after another, but sometimes they were mushed together. And I can't honestly remember if that's what happened with Dragonfire. But Maryland Public Television, just for the unfamiliar, in all American public television stations, they get a lot of funding from viewers. So they have these things called pledge drives, and they try to put on their special program and their big program and things they think will get attention around pledge drive time. And then they interrupt the episode with people talking about the show and trying to get you excited and call in and get a Doctor Who tote bag and all those wonderful things. And so actually around the time that the Seventh Doctor era was happening, Maryland Public Television was getting these episodes fairly quickly. So I'm pretty sure we got Dragonfire as part of a big push. I think they did 2 episodes of Sylvester McCoy's first season one night, and then the next Saturday they did the next 2. Dragonfire, unfortunately, is not my favorite episode of Doctor Who by a long stretch, but Ace was really something. Ace was really exciting to see. And so I remember being really, really excited about the next season to come. And then, of course, the same way, we would just wait for Maryland Public Television to tell us when these things were coming and tune in and pledge and keep it all going.
When we talk about Dragonfire, that was Ace's first episode, so not just yours seeing her. Is that the same for you, Mark?
Yeah, almost identical. Mike, it's very weird. I grew up in Delaware in the U.S. on the East Coast there, and happened to be sort of at a nexus point between 2 PBS stations, the Philadelphia station and the NJN station, which is kind of a famous station. They would do documentaries, and they're probably still on DVDs and Blu-rays right now. So we would have it every Friday and every Saturday night. And NJN was notorious for being like the first station to show Colin Baker and Hartnell and maybe even Sylvester McCoy. I can't remember. So, yeah, I watched it probably right around the same time as you, Mike. Not when it aired, but shortly thereafter. And, yeah, the Sylvester McCoy's first season, is not my favorite. It's definitely one of the weaker seasons. I can enjoy all that stuff. And it was funny thinking about this a little, which are good Ace episodes, and I may be skipping ahead a little bit here. But really, in Dragonfire, you're right, Mike, it's not the best episode, but it probably is the best of the first season. And it probably has a lot to do with Ace. I mean, God bless Bonnie Langford, but Mel just didn't really work for me. It was a little too soap opera. And Ace was kind of the opposite of that. So, yeah, when she came along in Dragonfire, I thought it was a good story, not a great story, but it was promising for things to come. So, yeah, I saw it back when it started. One little note on that. I do remember at the time being in a comic book shop and looking at a Doctor Who magazine, and not buying it, but just kind of like reading through the news items. And it mentioned that there would be a new companion coming this season. So as I'm watching on PBS, I couldn't remember the details because I didn't buy the magazine. And I'm waiting. And when we got to Delta and the Bannerman, I was convinced Delta was going to be the new companion, like a new kind of modern Leela warrior character. And, of course, that didn't happen. And so we finally got Ace. So I had misread that. And I think I heard later Ray from Delta and the Bannerman was also a possibility. But, of course, they went with Ace. So, yeah, that's my history. Like Mike, I'm a long time, sounds like, viewer of the show. Ace is definitely a standout for me, I would say, too.
For the unfamiliar, Maryland and Delaware are neighbors. We share a long border on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. And
I've lived in Maryland too. I know your PBS stations.
Oh yeah. I was Annapolis born and raised. It's really neat being in that part of the world because you have a lot of major metropolitan areas that you can pull in from a lot of stations. And it sounds like, I'm sorry, you were getting the New Jersey network. Is that right? Did I understand that right?
NJN from obviously New Jersey, and then from Philadelphia, we would get it was Channel 12. So they both showed them Friday and Saturday night. Yeah.
Those New Jersey folks, they were famous for doing documentaries too. I think that's the group that went over and did the big long Doctor Who documentary that was, I think Silver Nemesis.
Yep.
They were around for, and they did a great big documentary. So yeah, they were big pioneers. So on the East Coast of the U.S., we were getting a lot of really, really good Doctor Who, and really fast.
What's actually interesting when we sometimes have American guests on, particularly American guests that are kind of, if we just say older than millennials, is the story of Doctor Who, because we do as a segment sometimes here talking about the BBC and how the relationship between the show and the BBC, and sometimes precarious relationship between Doctor Who and the BBC, but how in some ways it's also a story of television in other countries. So the story of Doctor Who in some respects seems to be also the story of public television in the US and regional public television, which is just something I hadn't considered until you lot were talking about it just then.
If you remember also, Shane, that's back when, this is early cable, if anything. So in many cases, when I started watching Doctor Who, there's 4 channels or, maybe a couple, I forget what they call them, UHF or something, but you had the main 3 channels and then a PBS. So if you wanted kind of an alternative weird thing like Doctor Who, that's where you were looking.
Right. They actually tried Doctor Who on WBFF in Baltimore. They ran it in the afternoons as part of Captain Chesapeake. Captain Chesapeake was our kid show host, and they ran some episodes, and I guess I was maybe like in 5th grade then, and it just wasn't successful at all. I think it was on, and it vanished as quickly as it could. I've done some research on this, but it's been a long time since I looked this history up. But if I remember this correctly, when the BBC established that relationship with public television stations, they were building on a connection that they already had, because a lot of American public television programming is actually imported British dramas and then later imported British sitcoms. Mm-hmm. So they had a company back then called Lionheart. It was Lionheart, the BBC in America. Yep. And I think, if I remember correctly, that was really lucrative for them for a very, very long time. And so things like Doctor Who were really building a lot of revenue for them in the States. But it just became a different sort of model. It was like, I think there were some commercial stations here that carried some shows successfully, but it almost always ended up being on public television stations. I was told by a person, I went to grad school in Indiana, and I was told by a man who was the programming director of the public television station out there that he didn't want to get Doctor Who. He told me that he didn't want Doctor Who because once you had it, you couldn't get rid of it. The fans were so aggressive and so excited about it that you couldn't ever let it go. And so he didn't ever want to start it. He was he was afraid, I guess, that the fans would be too vociferous.
Sounds like the BBC in the mid-'80s, too. Same attitude.
Even as you're talking about it, the notion of Doctor Who and its relationship with public television, it's almost as if the kind of people who are predisposed to having public television, thinking public television is a good thing, maybe helping fund public television, are the kind of people who are also going to be in Doctor Who. I don't even wonder if that's slightly influenced how they write the show, because it's like, well, these are the kind of people that are going to be interested in a show like this. Where if we stick it on CBS, would they even know how to market something like that? Back in the day, I mean. So it's almost as if there's been an indivisible link between the two, and then that does bring up not necessarily negative questions, but further questions of Doctor Who now being part of the story of streaming. Because for everyone, apart from where I live, they'll be watching the show on Disney Plus, and there'll be people who didn't have a Disney Plus subscription who now maybe begrudgingly forced to get one.
For us, I'm assuming it was this way for Mark too. For us, the experience was that you would get the same reruns over and over again, and that's not a complaint. And we would do a lot of the Tom Baker years and all of those things. And then it was not until really the new show came over here. First it was on the Sci-Fi Channel, and then it was on BBC America, that we ever got close to seeing things the same times that you did. And now, yeah, we're all part of this global streaming village where we'll be getting it all at once. It's going to be really, really fascinating. I teach at the University of Lynchburg, and 20 years ago when I started, nobody knew what Doctor Who was. Now people know. They may or may not have watched, and it's really about to become as mainstream as it possibly can in this country, I think.
I mean, that's something I imagine we'll be talking about on this podcast once the show is back on Disney Plus and how it's running. And also, that's where we start having to, well, I say we, not you lot, me, have to start paying attention to like stuff at Disney's stock price, because that's what this stuff is all for. It's really the story of Wall Street, and Doctor Who is just a tiny, tiny part of that story now, which I'm sure some fans may hate, but that's the only way we're having the show. Otherwise, there would be no Doctor Who right now. It is notable at least, how Doctor Who is combined with television, because also, PBS. Oh, you watch PBS. Oh, you're that kind of person then. I imagine there is an assumption of the kind of person you are, because even of the networks that you would watch back then. Maybe a bit different now, because there's, like 100 networks or whatever. If we move on to the next thing, we would get back to Ace, Mark. Her as a character, for those who've never seen her, what would you say are her most distinctive characteristics?
Right from Dragonfire, I think Ace is just unique from, every other companion to that point in certain ways, especially a contrast with Mel, who, as I said, is kind of, a little pantomime, a little soap opera, screaming. And Ace might seem dated now, but I'm going back to 1987, 1988. She seemed kind of like a normal teen, like a real person. And then as this show went on, she has a relevant backstory. It's not just she's a botanist from Pease Pottage, or I don't know why I keep picking on Mel. But, Ace had some family issues and issues with bullies and things like that. And it's reflected in her character, which is, outwardly very tough. And then sometimes you see the vulnerable side with the Doctor. So, it's a big jump forward that at the time, I think that's when, ratings were really dropping and people had kind of given up on the show. But there's like some really good stuff in the last two seasons. If you're thinking, what are the good stories from the Sylvester McCoy era? It's really just not the first three, which are before Ace gets in there. And then maybe if you threw Ace into Paradise Towers, that might be a more grounded and more interesting story.
That the who a person is often influenced by what's around them, and you're not the same person if your external circumstances are different. Sorry, Michael, anything you want to add on that?
I was going to say, if Ace had been in Paradise Towers, it would have ended in 2 episodes. She would have blown something up.
Yeah,
it would have been solved faster. Like Mark is saying, there's something so different about Ace. I always refer to her as modern, like in 2 senses of the word. She's modern for the time period. So they actually, I can't say because I wasn't living in England in the 80s, but from what I've read, they tried hard to capture a more modern sense of teenage life. How well they did, that's beyond me. But she seemed more real in that way. She seemed more contemporary than folks before her had. I love Perry, and Perry's fantastic, but Perry theoretically is from Baltimore, Maryland, and she doesn't feel like somebody I would have grown up with, which is, kind of what would have happened. But Ace feels connected to her time period and her location and all of those things. And then I also think she's just very modern in the sense that she prefigures the companions that are to come. She gets these backstories. She gets more action. She doesn't steal the show, but she gets moments that are totally devoted to her. She gets some agency. She really feels like a contemporary character. And again, I can't speak too authoritatively for what was happening in the UK at the time, but in the States at the end of the 80s and going into the 90s, they were trying to do that. They were recognizing in television that people wanted lots of characters to be particularly interesting. You didn't want it to just be, I love the Rockford Files. I don't know how many folks are familiar with the Rockford Files here. Great show from the 70s. Jim Rockford is a well-developed character. His father's developed. His friend Angel is developed. Not too many other characters are developed. People come and they go and they slip by. But here, thanks to shows like Dallas and other things, people started wanting to see more interest in more characters. So Ace really starts to set the stage, not just for what happens in Doctor Who later, but what happens in shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and other programs to come. So that's what I really, really love about her. She's just independent, active, exciting, interesting. Like Mark, Mel, I don't want to be mean about it. Mel's okay, but Mel feels very old school. And when Ace comes around, it's like, oh, new school. It's time to be different. And that's one of the really kind of sad things about the show getting canceled when it did, was it would have been nice to see her arc finish up, and then it would have been nice to see what they did with other companions afterwards.
She did get a fairly decent arc, though, especially for the time. They kind of crammed it in. But the final season is a lot of Ace, and survival, considering it wasn't supposed to be, is a good cap for the series, I feel. And for Ace, she has her kind of struggles in that one, and she's had struggles all season facing the demons of her family and stuff. And again, Mel, Perry, like you said, they're fine. And it's not crammed down your throat either. It's kind of part of the story and woven in really well. So a different kind of character. And as a lot of people point out, the end of the run of Doctor Who, the classic series, isn't a million miles off the start of the new run with Rose and the Eccleston, even though it's many years later.
When I was very young, I vaguely remember Doctor Who on, because I kind of like Matt Smith, Kerrigan, grew up in the wilderness years where it wasn't on TV. But I have vague memories of Sylvester McCoy of that time, so that I probably would have caught her on TV as like 4 years old or whatever, but just wouldn't have retained any memories. But I have done obviously a little bit of research, and one of I think the most distinctive things about her, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you'll know the history better than me, that she was probably the first companion to like step to a Dalek, like not to cower. I mean, she comes up to a Dalek, takes a baseball bat, and beats the shit out of it.
Small human female sighted on level 3.
What are you calling small?
And that's not something that ever happened. And I guess as ways of trying to rejuvenate the show, keep it fresh, the Daleks are famously known. My mum's talking about this. The thing about the Daleks was they made everyone cower behind the sofa back in the day. They were the truly terrifying monsters. And I've seen, at the sadly no longer existing Doctor Who experience, I've been there and seen young kids looking at Daleks now and be terrified. I've seen just the sight of them make very young children cry. So they have had that impact, and that obviously comes from you see how the characters react, and they often react horrified, almost like you're trapped by your school bully kind of reaction. And Ace was the first one to, not that she may not have been scared, but always display courage and, you could argue, even a degree of recklessness as far as how she'd dealt with them. And I mean, you see a character, again, it's not the Doctor, it's a human doing that. That immediately says, okay, she's kind of different. I mean, as far as well, like you think of a time period, I don't know if either you saw Russell T Davis's last show, It's a Sin, set in the 1980s. And I think of the characters in that who are probably a similar generation, age-wise, to Ace. And I say it's incredible when you think of who the Prime Minister was, but it's probably because of who Prime Minister was at the time that you had a deliberate countercultural reaction from young people. So you have kind of a leather jacket or a bomber jacket. You have a distrust or a almost punkish, deliberate pushing back against authority or establishment figures. You even think of the way that she almost never calls the doctor. She calls him professor. And Sophie, well, we mentioned Sophie Aldred, who's the actor who plays the character, but she has been on the record more than once when she starts, why do you call him professor all the time? And it's like, well, because he told me not to, as in the show, not Sylvester McCoy. Like the character says that I'm not the professor, I'm the doctor. So of course she's going to keep calling him professor. It's a bit trollish and it's a bit juvenile, but it's the kind of thing that any young person would do. But it's also symptomatic of young people in that time of, I'm not going to do it because you told me to. This thing is meant to scare me. Well, now I'm not going to be scared. I'm going to step to it because I'm apparently not meant to do that. It's that thing that young people do, but I think it's very accurate depiction of what people of that age range, what was going on with them at that time. A bit of, that the Marlon Brando and the Wild Ones, what are you rebelling against, what you got? That kind of attitude. And I know Andrew Cartmel, who was the writer who introduced her, he's on record as saying that Ace was written to be a fighter and not a screamer, which deliberately or otherwise is throwing a hell of a lot of shade at Mel.
You don't want to make her sound awful in comparison, but Ace is dynamic, right? Like you're talking about those action scenes. It's not just that she goes after a Dalek with a baseball bat. There's this prolonged action scene. It's a very American action scene, but it's a big, long action sequence. She doesn't just hit a Dalek with a baseball bat. There's all this running and jumping and exploding before that moment. And she gets several of these. There's a big, long, protracted fight with the Cybermen and Silver Nemesis, and it just makes her very different. The Doctors had lethal companions, right? Leela is lethal. The Brigadier and unit can be lethal. But Ace was very energetic and very action-oriented, which really, really just made for this significant difference. I don't think Ace is like this bloodthirsty killer, but she will scrap if she has to. And she particularly does it in defense of her friends, in defense of people she's come to care about. I mean, I agree she's rebellious, but she has this very strong idea of justice and fairness and is very oriented towards defending the weak, which, again, is probably something that would be important in the context of Thatcherism at the time, right? And kind of people feeling like, oh, folks weren't standing up for those folks who maybe were being stepped on by the government. She's not quite a superhero, but she has that kind of great power, great responsibility kind of feel. She really is like Spider-Man and all that ilk. She really, really wants to help people. And that's the other really great thing about her.
You mentioned time period, and one of Margaret Thatcher's most famous lines is, there's no such thing as society. Very much like Ronald Reagan on your side of the pond, very much the rise of individualism and the rise of get what you can for yourself. And it's not about trying to help others. Life is a buffet table and get as much as you can, because if you don't, someone else will take it. So that probably makes a lot of sense as far as Ace's almost ferocious devotion to trying to help those that need help, which is definitely a trait you often see with Doctor. So that does make a lot of sense when we're thinking of what Ace was like and why she was like that and why the time period caused her to be like that. And also probably how Andrew Cartmel saw things himself. Often with characters, in some ways, you learn something about the writer with the characters that they put in the show.
Yeah. We've talked about this idea that for modern viewers, Ace might be unfamiliar because they're unfamiliar with the classic series. But I often think that if somebody's going to watch the older show, I either point them towards City of Death, which is a great Tom Baker episode, or I point them towards Remembrance of the Daleks. And I say, don't go back to the very beginning. And the reason that I do that is because it's a great era. It's a great episode. It's probably my favorite classic episode. but it's also more modern. And so if you want people to kind of see the show, they can kind of see this program that was becoming what they're very familiar with. Because I guess Mark and I, probably as old school Doctor Who fans, have spent a lot of time trying to convince people to watch this show. Do you have the same experience, Mark?
No, I just leave people alone. I don't bother them with my show. No, I would agree definitely on City of Death, which is very fun. You know, it's obviously a classic episode, very fun, almost like a romantic comedy in a way. Remembrance is definitely one of my favorite stories, but something with the Cartmel era, it does seem more fan-focused. Great stories like Ghostlight and Curse of Fenric, but you really have to pay attention to get it. And, you know, famously, Ghostlight, people say they've watched it many times and don't get it. So I thought it was great. It took it to kind of a next level. Depends on your audience. I think, you know, ratings were down at the time, maybe initially because the stories weren't so great. And they never really, I think, got back to that general audience. But Remembrance is a classic to me. I don't know if I would start somebody on it. There's the backstory. It's referencing an unearthly child and Omega, which is part of the mythology of the show. So great story, but maybe the second round after they've seen City of Death and so forth.
And or just remembering that obviously Mike mentioned that scene I mentioned from Remembrance of the Daleks when Ace attacks the Dalek. I just mentioned the baseball bat bit, which is probably the bit that if anyone's seen anything from Ace, it's probably that. But the scene does go on, and the Dalek is shooting at her, and she has to duck behind tables and stuff. And of course, the production values are nothing like you see in America, nothing like that. I mean, they're not even now. But you look at that, and that is almost like a scene from Die Hard, when John McClane is dodging, shooting at like 3 people and dodging bullets, because obviously they're not going to shoot him because their aim is always going to be terrible. But her running and ducking behind stuff.
If you've been watching Doctor Who for a few years, there were some things in the later seasons that, you know, you're right. It seemed like Die Hard almost. I remember when the Dalek came out in Remembrance of the Dalek and just fired like a competent laser shot in the guy's skeleton, and he goes flying into the dirt bags or whatever it is. You know, that was like, whoa, this is Doctor Who. That seemed like Star Wars for 5 seconds there. So you're right, they did bring some innovation during that time as well.
And also this is the rise of the action movie from America.
Yeah, that's in a lot of those episodes when Ace is kind of the action star more than Sylvester McCoy is, running around in Battlefield, several stories, Survival. She's running around a lot and doing all that, fighting.
She's definitely just something completely different.
Now, we've already mentioned quite a few episodes of the pros of this, but if we can just nail down in both your separate opinions, Mike, what do you think the best episode is that Ace is in?
I think it's Remembrance.
That's some serious hardware. Did you see that, Professor? Unsophisticated, but impressive.
Smith! Sir? Get on the radio, call up Brew 4 and 6, tell 4 to pick up an ambulance on the way.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't matter how many men you get here. It isn't going to make any difference.
Doctor, my men have just put 3 high-explosive grenades into a confined area. Nothing even remotely human could have survived that.
That's the point, Group Captain. It isn't even remotely human.
Like Mark was saying, there's a lot of payoff for sticking with Ace. You know, you should really watch every episode she's in. I mean, if you want to skip Dragonfire, fine. But it really does have that sort of serial quality. You do get to watch her develop as a character. I hate to pick favorites, Shane. I hate to do it. But if I've got to pick a favorite, it's probably Remembrance. It was just, like we were saying, so different. You know, Mark said, wait, that's Doctor Who? And it really was amazing. Some people complained that later Doctor Who got Americanized, and I don't think that's completely true. I don't think I fall for that episode because it's like everything else I watched. I just think that that's the moment where you can point and say, wow, everything is different, everything is great, everything is better. You start getting these scenes with Sylvester McCoy where you start getting these hints that there's more to the Doctor than you realized. You get some wonderful, I don't want to spoil, but you get some wonderful surprises. And then you just get Ace being really different. We were kind of used to meeting a new companion, and then the companion just falls into a fairly standardized role. Like Turlo. Turlo's great, and Turlo has this little arc, like, oh, I'm going to kill the Doctor, and then that arc goes away, and then Turlo is just a fairly standard companion until maybe his last episode he gets a little something else to do. So there was that fear that, like, oh, Ace will kind of, I don't know, flatten out, but she didn't. And I think it's probably one of my favorite episodes of the classic series. It's certainly my favorite Ace episode because we just see everything that she's going to be capable of doing.
Is it the same episode for you, Mark? You got a different one?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to agree with Mike. You have to get some more diversity at your guests here, maybe Shane. It's a great episode, and when you think about it, a lot of that is Ace. Mike just outlined a couple things there, but I'll go back to it and say that unlike Mike maybe a little bit, I did enjoy Dragonfire, maybe because it was after the first 3 episodes of the first season, which were kind of I saw a lot of promise there, and looking back on that, I think that is, it ends with the Doctor and Ace gone off, and we've seen Ace, kind of like a pilot episode of Ace in the last episode of season 24. Then we have a little bit of a wait, and we're doing this in real time, and then, okay, this should be good. Oh, Daleks, we haven't seen them in a couple seasons. And, it was a great episode. If you're a fan, especially, I think, as I was saying before, but Ace is right out of the gate. She's, blowing people up or blowing Daleks up and blowing things up. So later episodes, since we kind of already went through a lot of remembrance of the Daleks, there's other, especially I think in the last season, a lot of those stories are focused on Ace. So Ghostlight, Survival,
Curse of Fenric, Mark. Curse of Fenric.
Obviously. Curse of Fenric. So you could pick those as well. And in some ways, they're more dealing with her backstory. And they weave that in very, very well, I think, in all 3 of those stories. But in remembrance, it's kind of like the first Matt Smith episode, it's just like hits the ground running, and everything's kind of clicking. I would say that one too. Just that you guys were going through a lot of these things. Just a final thing I notched down here, and one last dig at Mel, I guess, for no reason, which she's fine. But in Dragonfire, again, that's kind of like Ace's pilot episode in a way. I think because she wasn't even, they were considering her versus Ray from the previous episode, and Cartmel decided on Ace. So it's even written like that. She could have not even gone off with the Doctor. But at one point, I think it's when they're down in the mines, and sorry for spoilers a little bit here, but they come up.
No, we don't do that kind of thing here. As in, we spoil, because how are we going to talk about episodes without not talking about episodes? I think spoiler warnings are absurd for a podcast about Doctor Who when we're talking about the past.
Okay, great. I hate spoilers, but I agree with you there. There's a scene where they finally come across the titular dragon, and Mel goes right into classic shriek mode.
Hang on. Are you sure this is the right way?
Of course I'm sure. Don't you trust me?
Well, I don't know. What with the dragon and all that?
The dragon. It's just something to frighten little children with. It's like witches and goblins. There ain't no such thing.
Ace is just giving this look, and I think she looks at Mel like, will you calm down? What are you doing? And it's obvious that a transition is going to happen by the end of the episode. And maybe once or twice Ace screams, but I can't remember in which instance. And considering, if this is a real situation and you're coming across Daleks and Cybermen, I would probably be screaming at certain points. So great character. They nail her. Like I said, the 11th hour, I couldn't think of the Matt Smith episode. But that's another one, it's right out of you get the character right out of the gate. The story's great. Remembrance of the Daleks for me as well.
Yeah, and I think we should be clear. We don't have a problem with characters or women showing fear. It's just don't be like Fay Ray from King Kong, or like those silent movies where they tie the woman to the train tracks, and someone's got to get off the train tracks before the train arrives. That kind of character.
Yeah, there's a couple of companions that's almost their defining characteristic.
Okay, now, modern fans, they shouldn't be, totally unfamiliar with Ace, because she appeared in the most recent episode of Doctor Who, The Power of the Doctor, Jodie Whittaker's final episode, or final episode for now. I'm sure we'll see her again. What, Mark? What were your general thoughts on her appearance and showing up in that, and like what she got to do?
So I don't have strong opinions. I did like the episode. I thought it was a good finale. I'm not the biggest fan of the Chibnall era. I did go to Gallifrey 1, and he was there last year. He seemed like a really nice guy.
We say a lot. He seems to be a lovely human being. Our criticism of him is never personal. It's just about the show.
I thought there was a good use of Ace from what I remember, and it's very nice to see her and the Dr. Sylvester McCoy again. She's almost a little bit of a Peter Pan character, though, to me, or Ferris Bueller, because she is youthful energy, very iconic character who, I don't know how far you guys go, but I'm pretty crazy with Big Finish and the books and all that. And if you like Ace, there is a lot of Ace out there. I could list through. She's died multiple times in different comics and books and so forth. And as much as I love the character on the television show, I do feel like she got a good arc. And what they do with her later in the books, they make her kind of a soldier who hates the Doctor for a period. The show was building to those kinds of things, but I don't think that it would have got that extreme. And there's some interesting stuff there. But again, I kind of, the best Ace is 16, 18-year-old Ace with the Doctor. Sophie Aldred was really well cast as Ace.
Mike, what were your thoughts on Ace and the Power of the Doctor?
I am a giddy fan. And I often feel like, and I don't want it to sound like I'm not critical, but I'm often so genuinely happy to be getting more Doctor Who. I think because of the American experience, it was just always like, what is this? There's more of it. There was a time in my life I didn't even, I just thought Tom Baker was it, right? And then it was like, wait, what do you mean there's stuff before it? What do you mean there's stuff coming afterwards? Over here in my office, I've got a 20th anniversary Doctor Who magazine that has been so lovingly thumbed through from my childhood, just trying to read as much as I possibly could about this show, and was constantly hoping to get new things. So every time there's something new, I'm usually pretty happy. I was ridiculously excited. I can't remember who you hear first in the first trailer that they released for The Power of the Doctor. I can't remember if you hear Tegan first and then Ace or whatever, but I just perked right up.
I think Ace actually. No, sorry, in the trailer it's Tegan. It's Tegan, and then you cut to Ace.
It's Tegan, and then it's funny. My family who watches Doctor Who with me, they're more modern fans. My wife is a fantastic science fiction nerd, but I had to convince her to watch Doctor Who. We made the marriage work. We made it work, and then she fell in love with the modern show, and it was fantastic, and she loved it. But I feel sorry for her because she often gets these moments where it's like, what are you excited about? And it's like, oh my God, this. And then there's like 20 minutes of me explaining something. But of course she knew who Ace was, and she knew who Tegan was. And it was just so thrilling to get them back. Now, like Mark says, if you're in the Big Finish world, they haven't gone away. They have been producing tons of stories, and there's a lot of stuff with Ace. There's a lot of stuff with Tegan, and they're largely really, really good stuff. And these performers really know these characters. But there's something about the primacy of the television experience. There's something about Ace is back home, right? She's back on TV. She's back doing the things that she does. And I really was very happy. Was happy with Tegan returning too, but I was really very happy to have Ace back and to have her doing, once again, active stuff, to really be pushing forward, to really being the character that I knew. I'm just always happy to see these characters again. I think Doctor Who could run the risk of bringing everybody back all the time, which is something you don't want the show to do. But it was just really, really fun to see her back in that context. And then the other really fun thing about it was that both Tegan and Ace, although we didn't see it, right, it was alluded to later, sort of left under more challenging circumstances. So it was nice to see them maybe heal up some rifts and fix some character conflicts. But no, I was absolutely giddy. I loved it. I was a little worried because the previous story with Sea Devils I was not as happy with.
It was terrible.
Yeah, it was a challenging episode.
Yeah, we did a pod on that here. Yeah, we hated it.
Yeah. But so I was pretty happy with this. I was pretty excited. And just to have her back, have her work in without being a detriment to the character, without it being stunt casting, it was a lot of fun. So, but that's me. Like I said, every time there's more Doctor Who, I am always happy. There's an old joke about American fans. Well, I think Doctor Who fans in general, but American fans. And the old joke is, how many Doctor Who fans does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is none. They just sit around and wait for it to come back on. And it's a dad joke now, I guess.
It works. It works.
And that's always been my experience. So that's me. I'm just always waiting for it to come back on. I just cannot wait to see more. I cannot wait to see what happens.
We did a pod about the episode itself at the time, so I've already spoken quite a bit on what I thought of the episode and Ace's inclusion in it. I think it broadly worked. I said the only reason, because I actually think that's Chibnall's best written episode that he wrote, but I think the reason was because it was feature length, and had it been a standard length episode it would have been a mess, but because he had extra time it meant that you could have not just the inclusion of like Tegan and Ace, but most importantly the scene that really worked is the scene that Ace has with the 7th, and also that Tegan has with the 5th. Like those interactions they had with their doctors is what makes it work. If you don't have that scene, then it's just like, hey everyone, remember her, and without really doing that much. But because they had enough time to give them those moments, it was worthwhile. And when they showed up in the trailer, I was as excited as anyone, even not being wholly familiar with their work. I was still really looking forward to seeing them. Is there anything we've missed that either of you want to mention?
I think I referenced this earlier, but if you are a fan of Ace, I think Mike said he wanted to see what happened after Survival. There is a lot of Ace out there. So there was New Adventure Ace. There's Big Finish Ace that Mike referenced. She gets her own sort of companion in Hex, and then there's a whole arc with her and Mel back together. She had a long run in the Doctor Who magazine comic because of the wilderness years. They just kind of continued on. Same with the New Adventures. And then later she gets an arc in the previous Doctor Adventures where she dies or something in a clone. She becomes almost a Time Lord in Death Comes to Time. She was recently, I haven't read this yet, but there was a new novel at Childhood's End, I think. And it was sort of tied into the new series. And they did a trailer a couple of years ago for a Blu-ray, which brought Ace back. And then there's even in one of the wilderness periods, the small company called BBV did a series without the rights to Doctor Who, but they had Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred called The Professor and Ace, I believe it was called. Professor and Ace. And there was a series of CDs I have around here somewhere as well. So there's a lot of Ace out there if you want to follow her adventures. Again, I think the best was on the TV when different people tried to expand that. Some of the ways that went didn't always work. But there are ones that are just kind of slotted in, books and Big Finish that are more slotted in 18-year-old Ace or 16-year-old Ace. So a lot of Ace out there, I guess, would be my closing thoughts. And I think that's a good thing. Definitely one of the most iconic companions. I don't pick favorites that much either. But yeah, definitely a memorable, iconic companion.
A lot of the stuff Mark was saying is another reason I love Ace. There's like multiple Aces. We mentioned the Spider-Verse. You can almost make an argument for an Ace-verse, right? There's so many opportunities and so many variations because she fell into that period. You called it the wilderness years. She fell into that period where the character could be multiple things. And I think that's one of the things that makes her a lot of fun. But I think it also shows her staying power. If this character wasn't working, they would have quickly replaced her. If there was no potential to this character, they would have quickly found something else. And there just constantly seems to be more things to do with Ace. And again, that's one of those things that I think makes her feel very much like a modern companion. I guess on the modern show, sometimes there's companions and it's like, yeah, glad you're gone. See ya. Bye-bye. But most of the time we kind of feel like, I wish we could have seen more of that character, or you almost feel like, they can almost spin that character off into their own thing. And Ace was doing that before any of the others were. She really is the modern companion before modern companions.
This is partly to piggyback some of the stuff you said. I did, when I was researching, find out about some of the kind of almost EU, as in extended universe, not European Union, kind of the EU stuff in the gap of Ace, becoming a Time Lord and stuff and dying, and those are things that I'm kind of glad aren't official or aren't, let's say they're not fixed points in time, because I'm glad those aren't actually in the actual TV story, because I don't think those were good ideas at all. But it is one of the things that's mentioned about her a bit is, quote unquote, the first modern companion, and I don't think intentionally, but she does prove a very good bridge, I think, between the two eras of the show, because I think Russell T Davies has alluded to this, that who she is hugely, or can be seen very clearly in the kind of companions we're used to seeing now. And the modern day companion is a lot more like the last classic one than maybe any of the other classic ones. And it's notable that she appears on screen in 1987, but her character is actually from the future. I suspect, because you don't see that often, I suspect part of the reason for that is to almost justify or get away with how she would behave, because imagine people being like, well, a woman wouldn't, I'm not saying they wouldn't, obviously, women wouldn't, but that's how, shall we say, the media establishment might say it, through looking through it for a very sexist prism. So it's like, well, a woman wouldn't act like that, that's not realistic. You can just say, she's from the future. Women are different in the future. It's just an easy way to get around it, rather than come away with stuff, this isn't very realistic, when it's like, well, it's Doctor Who. A lot of it isn't. So I'm wondering if that was part of why they said, well, she's originally from the future, which is why she maybe acts different to the kind of women, definitely the kind of women you would usually see on TV at that time. And in some ways I was thinking this as well, because Mike talking about her being fiercely protective of the people she's close to, and in some ways she's quite an exploited companion. I'm thinking of some ways the crescendo of the Curse of Fenric, and there's some extended stuff in the gap between the show being on TV where at times the Doctor doesn't treat her well, but it's all in the service of trying to defeat the enemy. He's misdirecting the enemy, but sometimes he uses Ace as a pawn, and it's very interesting that to do that with a character that is, loyalty seems very important to her.
They take that and run with that in the books, where the Doctor's like just killing her boyfriends and planets for the greater good and all this, it's almost like it's designed just to put all this emotional weight on Ace, and that causes a rift, like I said. And again, I think it's better how they do it, more subtle in the TV series. And again, there are some good stories, but the overall way a lot of the potential futures, I guess we'll call them, in the books and Big Finish get a little too angsty. And, some of that was at the time they were trying to be more adult than the TV show had been. So you can imagine what avenues that would go down in a more of a R-rated or PG-13 kind of setting than traditional Doctor Who, I guess.
In some ways reminds me not of Clara. In fact, if Clara was exploited, but the way that they get put in Clara, it's more self-inflicted, but they get put in really dangerous situations at times where it almost feels, it pushes things almost as far as you can take them.
There's a riff on that. It's the Curse of Fenric, where Ace has to lose faith. He's kind of putting her down, and I feel like that happens in the modern series, almost like a callback.
In the comic series, so again, being careful with spoilers, but I think folks know this. In the comic series, they kill Ace off. And I think as long as what happens with Ace is in the service of good drama and character development, that works really well. When it's just done to upset the Doctor or to push the Doctor in a certain direction or to, service his character's needs, then it becomes really worrisome. I think there's a lot of interesting questions about these challenges that the Doctor puts Ace through, and whether he should have been a little more forthcoming or whether she could have learned if he had been. Those are interesting questions, and I think that's what creates an interesting dynamic between them. I don't think it's done out of cruelty. That particular comic book story, when I finally read that, it was hard to get here, and when I finally read it, I was really disappointed by it, because I kind of thought, this is just so the Doctor gets mad. So I think as long as it's about Ace, then they can make it work in the story.
And also one thing, Mike, because full disclosure for the listeners, part of the reason why we chose this as a topic to do a pod on was, Mike, you mentioned you'd written something on Ace quite recently.
Yeah, I'm working on an article. The article is finished. We're waiting for it to come out. Article called "Come on, Ace." We've got work to do. The development of the modern companion on Doctor Who, and it's for a collection for a book that's coming out, which right now is titled "Being a Girl with the Doctor: Essays on the Feminine in Doctor Who." It's Gillian Leach and Sherry Jin are the editors on that. They've been fantastic to work with. So yes, I am so steeped in Ace. It's been great. I have a fantastic job. In order to do research, I have to sit around and watch a bunch of Doctor Who DVDs and then watch the making of specials. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. I've been having a lot of fun. That and the World of Demons stuff that we've done has been a blast. I'm just having a grand time with all this Doctor Who scholarship. So yeah, but I cannot tell you when that book is coming out. The whole sort of academic world got a little bumped around by COVID and things like that, but it's coming soon, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think there's going to be a lot of great essays in there.
Is there any kind of penciled in release date yet?
No, I know nothing. I saw the cover. Cover looks great.
So at some point in the future, listeners, that will be there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, some point in the future, right? Well, maybe not as far in the future as we were trying to push Ace, but I think I heard the fall, but I can't speak for it. It's not my project, but I know it's coming, and they're working really hard on it.
So that's a Doctor Who book that is on the way in the future, and a Doctor Who book that is available to purchase now is Doctor Who World of Demons and the Villains of Doctor Who, and Mark and Mike both contributed to that. They both contributed chapters. Mark, do you just want to briefly just say what your chapter was about in the book?
Originally, I think I had pitched Omega. If you hear me talking here, I like, the whole books and everything to include that. So I was going to do some sort of study on Omega, including all the spin-off fiction. But I was told by a said editor that they were focusing more on the new series, even though I think a couple classic series might have slipped through somehow. So I pivoted, and either they were taken or, the kind of big ones, the Daleks and so forth. I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to do something that had been less discussed, even though, you can find new angles, obviously. So I just tried to think of went through the stories basically, and what was a really, really good story, and one that's, to me, if you think about it, it's a classic, but it was in a good era, is the Amy's Choice, which is just, I think, a great story. And then when you get into the heart of it, the enemy there is the Doctor. It ends up being, what is it, like a spore or something like that, that's directing all this, but it's coming from it's the Doctorverse himself. So that was my pitch, the ultimate enemy, which has been used many times, I think, in Doctor Who, or the enemy within. Like Mike was saying, I'm sure you guys know, it's you have your idea, then it's just kind of fun. You just keep watching the episode again and again to find more stuff in it. So that was my essay, and yeah, I was real happy with how it turned out.
Mike, do you want to briefly talk about yours?
It was like a Doctor Who experience. A friend of mine said, somebody is doing a Doctor Who book. You should talk to these guys. So I sent them a message, and they were like, yeah, we're doing a Doctor Who book. And I was like, so we talked about it a little bit. And they said, we're concentrating on the villains. And I was like, oh, can I have the Cybermen? Which I thought somebody surely would have had the Cybermen by then. But either nobody wanted them or nobody felt like it. And they were like, yeah, write about the Cybermen. And I was like, oh, no, I got to write about the Cybermen. But I had a lot of fun with it. I looked at... Again, I tried to watch every Cyberman episode, which was a blast. No, I'm doing research. Seriously, it may look like I'm sitting around watching TV shows, but I'm doing research. And it was a blast. And I looked at the Cybermen and this emotionless quality of theirs. I linked them to the Body Snatchers, the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that classic 1950s sci-fi film, and talked about how they function sort of like Body Snatchers. The Cybermen are a great Doctor Who foe, but they're really at their most interesting, not when you're saying, oh, how can I hit them with gold to kill them, but rather when you're dealing with this emotional quality of them. So I looked at some of the older episodes, like Tomb of the Cybermen, but then also was looking at some of the more modern stuff, Rise of the Cybermen, Age of Steel, all of those good things. So yeah, had a blast. That book is so much fun. Not just saying it because I'm in it. Anybody who loves Doctor Who would really enjoy World of Demons. It's really well written, and all the contributors have done just an amazing job.
And that book in question is available for purchase at bookshops online, and I believe a few actual physical bookshops. If you have any thoughts about what we've spoken about today, you can email us at analysingdoctorwho@gmail.com. That's analysing with an S. Or you can reach us on Twitter or now on Instagram at analysingdw. Mike and Mark, thank you both for being here.
Thank you. This was a blast. I had a great time.
Thanks, Shane. It was a lot of fun. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for listening. We will be back in around 6 weeks. Until next time. Our logo was courtesy of Scott Mattison. His work can be found at planetrisecreative.com and on Twitter at planetrise. Our theme tune is by Mike Mould. We can be reached at analysingdoctorwho@gmail.com and on Twitter at analysingdw.